Hello. So we are about to start. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, please take your seats. It is my great honor to be moderating this session among three titans of the multilateral world. So the Prime Minister Gaston Browne, the Prime Minister Mottley, and the SDG of the United Nations, António Guterres. The session today is about the call to action on mobilization of resources for seeds that the Prime Minister Browne is leading, the Bridgetown 3.0 consultation draft that the Prime Minister Mottley is leading, with the support of the UN towards the Summit of the Future that includes a proposal for the international financial architecture reform under the leadership of the UN Secretary General. We have only 30 minutes, so let's start reminding everybody that this is being webcast live. So, Excellencies, you have 3 minutes for the first question. 3 minutes. 3 minutes each for the first question. So let me ask you to set the stage on the impact of the last 4 years cascading and systemic shocks on your countries and the developing world. So, Prime Minister Browne, you have the floor first. We heard you very clear and loud where you said, we are in trouble, not because bad behavior, but because the shocks and the impacts of this cascading crisis and systemic shocks. Very important. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And you're absolutely right that the issues that we're faced with are not as a result of any bad policy, but because of these exogenous shocks that would have decimated our respective countries. Now, we have seen a situation even prior to COVID and the global crisis that small island states were very vulnerable. And during COVID, we'd have held discussions with the various international partners about helping small island states and other developing countries to build capacity, to help us to address the issue of debt sustainability. But what we found is that they have not been very responsive. In fact, when you go back to the situation during COVID, we recognize that many countries had become very insular. So even the issue of making PPEs available and vaccines, they took care of themselves and at one point banned the exportation of PPEs and even vaccines. Post-COVID, we thought that there would have been some movement towards helping us to achieve debt sustainability and even to build capacity, to have our own vaccine facilities, to help us to build out more resilient climate infrastructure, especially in light of the myriad crises that we have suffered as a result of these climate events. But again, we have not made any significant progress. In terms of the reform of the international financial architecture, many of us, and even those before us, have been arguing for decades for there to be reform to make the international financial architecture and the supporting institutions to be fit for purpose. And yet still, we have not made significant progress. And where new instruments have been introduced, as in the case of the Resilience Trust, they are not very inclusive. So, for example, the Resilience Trust does not cover countries that are not in an IMF program. So we are arguing for greater inclusivity to help developing countries, especially small island states, to build capacity so that we can become more resilient, our countries will be more climate resilient, so that the impact of future crises will not be as impactful as they have been in the past. However, we remain very hopeful and very optimistic, and that is why we have to continue the dialogue. And there are many of us on the front lines fighting for change, fighting for reform. And I certainly want to commend my dear friend here, Mia, who has been on the front line fighting for all developing countries, especially small island states. And of course, Secretary General, who has been a champion for developing countries, especially small island states. So Even though we have not seen the type of alignments and realignments, we still have to continue, and we are very hopeful that emanating from this SIDS4 conference, that there will be a number of institutions and initiatives that will emerge from this conference that will help us to address these issues that have been overlooked, and that we'll be able to attract more resources to address the issue of debt, utilizing a number of initiatives as outlined in the Bridgetown Initiative, and I'm pretty sure we'll discuss those initiatives later. And at the same time, to make sure that we have strong institutional arrangements that small island states in particular, that we work collectively to get realignment of these international financial institutions and even our international partners in development, for them to make more resources available, more technology available, and even to help us in research and development, to help us to harness additional opportunities, especially within the blue economy, to attract more ICTs, to include AI, so that we too can build resilient economies and prosperous economies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. Thank you. Only one indicator of what you just said. ODA for seats have gone down 12%. And now there are more resources going out from seats than the ones that are coming in. And so this is, I say that this is like a reversed a blood transfusion, yes? It's from the poor and the weak to the strong. So PM Mottley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I don't know how many more times we can say the same thing. And Secretary General, you caught it absolutely this morning by describing the pace of the crises as a Formula One car. And I forget the name of the other car that Trabant, as the pace of the reforms. And, you know, as children, we're taught not to be ungrateful. So we give thanks for the things that have been done, including the most recent one, this announced today by the World Bank with respect to ensuring that in all its loans for all SIDS, there will be access to natural disaster clauses. That's what we called it, but like when we were taken from Africa, they gave it a new name when it reached the World Bank and the UK. I think there's no CDRC, I'm not sure what it's called. But the point is that at least that's there. But that's not enough. We have a date with destiny, and I made the point this morning that finance is not the destination. Finance is only the medium by which we achieve the resilience that we need to achieve. And we are spending so much time and energy trying to get the financial reforms up to scale that we've forgotten that when we get that, we still have a marathon to run with respect to procurement, feasibility studies, execution, etc. So we today will launch for consultation Bridgetown 3.0. Tomorrow we'll speak about it at length. But essentially it seeks to, one, address that the rules of the game must change. The rules of the game in terms of who can represent who at the IFIs, having a voice for SIDS, the rules of the game with respect to per capita GNI being used as an instrument to exclude access or to make access more expensive depending on which one you're looking at. To secondly, shock-proof our economies. There are a number of countries that if they were given a shot of adrenaline, a bit of liquidity, would not find themselves needing to go into full IMF programs or full structural transformation. And if we give them that, it will ease the pressure on all of us. At the same time, we need to be able to see how else we can shock-proof the economies with the access to adaptation funding. And we keep making the point that we're not one-issue people. We can save the planet and die from the pandemic. We can save ourselves from the pandemic and die from the planet or die from crime. There are 6 Caribbean countries that are among the 10 most, the 10 countries with the greatest per capita rate, regrettably, of homicides in the world. Not because we make guns in this part of the world, but because we have open borders from which guns come. And that's the reality. And whereas you can hit a man with a rock and he survived, when you hit him with automatic bullets, he's more likely to die. And thirdly, that we want to be able to ensure that we scale up tremendously the volume of funding, not because we want to go on a spending spree, but if I don't do coastal infrastructure at the same time that I'm doing also resilient housing, at the same time that you're making access to do your labs so that you can do the public health monitoring, because climate and health now have a relationship that may lead to new pathogens that can in fact affect us. If you don't do these things all at once, you're going to be in trouble. And SG, there's one point that just listening to you this morning, that even though we are launching today for consultation, that I'm certain we will put it in at the end of the 30th of June. And that is 3 words: keep it simple. Keep it simple. You can't deal with small island states without understanding that it's the same handful of people doing everything. It's the same handful of people doing everything. And therefore, when you have these complex structures and hoops to go through, then you're effectively sentencing us before the game even starts. It's like the surcharges at the IMF. We are penalized for paying in accordance with the contractual terms. Put it another way, we're penalized if there's no early repayment. That can't be right. So these are the things that we want to put front and center. We believe that over the course of the next 18 months, we need to have a new deal. We have seen some progress. The RST is there, yes, for some. The natural disaster clauses for some. So we've seen some progress, but it is not enough. And if we can get the next 18 months focusing through the Summit for the Future, the annual meetings in October, we should leave the annual meetings with surcharges behind us and starting to look at extending the length of time for the extended fund facilities. We can look and see how we can also ensure that other IFIs use the type of clause that the World Bank, and the World Bank's clause is very good because it not only looks on modeling for parametric release, but it also looks at 10% actual damage, 10% of GDP actual damage. And that should be the model that the other MDBs take up. But we also need, as you said, and we've seen the decision to release some SDRs to some of the MDBs, but to your point, when you do that, you scale it up immediately and leverage it. Similarly with the guarantees out of Europe. It's not going to cost one European country anything on their balance sheet to be able to more aggressively use the guarantees, which will also unlock the funding. So if we can do this through the Summit for the Future, annual meetings, COP29, which is the financing COP, but the Financing for Development Conference in Spain next year, and indeed COP30, then we can leave ourselves the time and space, Gaston, to allow us then to get to the business of feasibility studies, to get to the business of pooled procurement, because that also needs to be a new initiative, because if you put small states to procure on their own, they can't get access to the market, and Rebecca, you know it well, with the supply chain issues that we've discussed. So we need to get on to those other meatier issues purely by reason of being able to get access to what, when you look at it, is a drop compared to the rest of the financing going for man-made problems like war. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Voice, inclusion, access, keep it simple, and pooled resources for scaling up. The Inter-American Development Bank was telling me today that they have 7 billion of demands that they cannot meet because they don't have the SDRs or they don't have the capitalization to really be able to respond. So, Secretary General, you have said the system is too small for the challenge. The floor is yours.
Yes, because the challenge is huge. I was Prime Minister of Portugal, and we have 2 archipelagos, Açores and Madeira. And I know the huge cost that it represented for the continent and with the support of the European Union to guarantee that those islands would have economic and social conditions similar to the continent. The cost was enormous. Small island developing states they have a negative handicap, a structural negative handicap of competitiveness in today's global economy. Now, they were able to respond to that with innovation in several areas, but it was essentially tourism. And then came COVID. And with COVID, tourism was not there. So they had to borrow money. And then when the money was borrowed, they couldn't print money like others, but because of the money that was printed and because of the war in Ukraine, prices went up, interest rates went up, and the money that was borrowed, now it's much more expensive. And to make things even more complicated, we see that the instruments that exist to address this problem are totally insufficient. And here, I have to say, all the proposals that were made until now in the different meetings in which we were, I mean, what I've seen is that there has been no political will to make the structural changes that are necessary for the system to work and address the challenge of the small island development states. And the system is too small. As I said this morning, the World Bank today has a paid-in capital that as percentage of global GDP is less than 1/5 of what it was in 1960. The system is too small. There is not enough capital in the financial system to respond to these challenges. And not only the system is small, but the system is distorted in its priorities. So the combination of these two factors makes the access of seeds to the resources they need extremely difficult. And there was progress, I agree, but it reminds me of the training of a cat to catch a mouse. You can do excellent things to improve the capacity of the cat to catch a mouse, but that what will not transform the cat into a tiger. And what we need today is a tiger, because it's not a mouse that we are trying to catch. We are trying to catch a huge antelope, because the problem is much bigger than the capacity of the system to address the problem. And so we start to have these fantastic things in which to give money to one, you take out money out of others. We heard today the appeal of the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And I mean, there is a structural change that needs to be made in the international financial system to make it correspond to today's economy and not to the economy of after the Second World War. Yep. And there is a number of practical things that can be done, but will force boards of entities to accept, to have the political will to change, and bureaucracies to recognize that the present procedures need to be changed. And one of that change is that you cannot treat equally everybody. When this is what Prime Minister Mottley said is clear. I mean, you cannot have the same methodology to deal with by the IMF or to deal with the problems of Argentina and to deal with the problems of a small island. I mean, I made to the IMF several times a proposal. You need to have a program for the small island that will address the problems of, let us say, 20, 25, or many that are in need in a way that is simplified, that is across the board, and will solve all of a sudden the problems of a large number of countries that we will never be able to solve country by country and with the same methodology that we use for big countries. I think that there is a cultural change, a structural change, but a cultural change that are needed for the system to respond to the needs of the challenge, of the seats.
Thank you so much, Secretary General, very clear. You know, all the multilateral development banks together lend out around $100 billion a year. This is 1/8 of the remittances that the South received, just to have a proportion. So really, really, thank you very much. When the COVID-19 struck and the prices went up also because of the war in Ukraine, you know how much these seats were impacted with respect to the rest of the world. For only maritime costs, seats were impacted 5 times more, 500% more in price increases than the rest of the world. So let me go now to Prime Minister Mottley. And Prime Minister, on the last 2 years, you have been a strong advocate for reform on international finance, calling for wide-ranging actions under the Bridgetown Initiative. Today, you are beginning a process of consultation on an update of this agenda. Can you tell us about the new agenda? What are your asks and what is new from Bridgetown 2.0?
In a sense, I told you what is premised on, with the rules of the games needing to be changed, that we need to shock-proof our economies better, and we need absolutely to ramp up scale. But I want to go to the core of the problem, if you don't mind. We all agree that it is absence of political will. And when we look at what is happening with the number of elections, we know all politics is local. We also know that in addition to that, it is compounded by geopolitics. But let me tell you from where I sit as a member of a small island developing state. How many heads of developed world are here, Gaston?
Good point.
They won't be here because they don't see us. Where do we get into a room with them that is not the General Assembly where speeches are happening? Where do we get into a room where we take decisions? It doesn't happen. So that if there is no room in which decision making can happen, then we continue to be serfs, for want of a better phrase, with a feudal overlord system. And the feudal overlord system are the countries that were former colonizers for the most part, who have continued to be able to direct the world either through the G7 or the G20, which is diluted a bit, but not sufficiently for the G7 not to get their will. Now, I may be saying the wrong thing in the wrong way, but I have to call it now for what it is. Because geopolitics and domestic politics are taking all of the oxygen out of the room. And yet, SIDS, what percentage do we have of the global economy? It's probably less than 1%. What percentage do we have of global debt? Probably hovering around 1%. And in spite of that, we tell people in the name of all of the religions of the world, protect the vulnerable. Take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. And the one place we don't practice what we preach is in the international political arena.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. So, Prime Minister Browne, you have been a champion of the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, and you are launching tomorrow the Debt Sustainability Support Service for SIDS. Yes. So can you expand on that for all of us?
Certainly. Thank you very much. And let me state here that the MVI is very important to ensure inclusivity going forward, to help SIDS in particular. And I'll add here the middle and high income SIDS to access much needed ODA and certainly concessional loans. This particular initiative, Debt Sustainability Initiative, will be an initiative that will be part of our Center of Excellence. We are determining that this SIDS conference should result in a number of institutions being established as well as initiatives to make sure that we promote the agenda of SIDS globally. Prime Minister Mottley indicated that, well, not necessarily in these precise words, but small island states have been treated as, let's say, elegant nuisances to some extent. We're not at the table. And that is why we continue to advocate for space at the table to serve on the boards of these institutions, to include the international financial institutions, and at the same time to make sure that we have a strong global voice. Now, the Bridgetown Initiative would have outlined a number of initiatives in order to include issues of debt swaps, the whole issue of SDG swaps, as well as debt write-offs and even restructuring. It also speaks to funding for more resilient infrastructure and for adaptation and mitigation. Now, what we're seeking to do here is to have an institution in the debt sustainability support service that will help to give support to these initiatives to help to address the issue of debt in a more collaborative way so that SIDS could come together and to address these issues together rather than going it alone, even in terms of, let's say, incurring debt to acquire certain products, even technological products. It's important that we have a coordinated effort. So we believe that the Debt Sustainability Initiative will facilitate greater coordination and collaboration going forward and will be a part of this Center for Excellence that will emanate from this SIDS4 conference. You note too that the SIDS4 conference and the Center of Excellence will also have a data hub. And this data hub is to assist SIDS in producing timely and accurate data, which will be very important for planning purposes. And even from the standpoint of addressing the issue of debt, you also need to produce timely and accurate data. So we see synergies here within the center. The center also has a biennial investment forum, which will be held, in which we will invite investors, the private sector, to look at opportunities within SIDS to invest and to obviously generate profits, but at the same time to ensure that we build out our economic infrastructure so that we can attract technologies in various sectors of the economy, and at the same time to have businesses that can generate opportunities for our citizens and our residents. So it is complementary to the Bridgetown Initiative, and it is the institutionalized arrangement that will take place post SIDS4 to make sure that we have a more coordinated approach. I mean, the Bridgetown document is an excellent document, but in terms of the actual implementation, I believe that the debt sustainability support initiative will help to give tangible effect to the Bridgetown Initiative and certainly other supporting initiatives as we seek to ensure that we address the issue of financial justice. We know that SIDS have not gotten their fair share of funding, and we want to make sure that we pursue financial justice in a very vigorous way going forward. And in order to achieve it, we have to make sure that we are well organized, and certainly this Debt Sustainability Initiative will assist us in providing that type of organizational support. And it not only addresses the issue of financing, even the issue of risk mitigation to insurance and other initiatives. In fact, it will also include advocacy. So we expect that those who serve within this framework, that they will be tasked with the responsibility to advocate globally to assist us in acquiring resources to deal with the issue of debt so that we can achieve debt sustainability within the next 10 years and certainly to achieve the SDGs.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister, so important. And so let me take this a common theme that the two Prime Ministers have talked about, that is to be at the table, the issue of inclusion and voice. And Secretary General, you have been very vocal in asking for the need for governance reform to enhance the voice of the developing countries, and especially for the SIDS. Can you expand on this, please?
Prime Minister Mottley just spoke about political will. I would add the word power. This is largely a problem of power relations and the exercise of power by the powerful to the detriment of the less powerful. And this is done, first of all, because the powerful control the decisions of the boards of the institutions. And second, because regulations were progressively being adopted that make that power be embedded in the way the system works. An example, the role of credit rating agencies. Credit rating agencies treat small island development states, I can imagine, even if you have very solid finance, in a very bad way. Because credit rating agencies are basing their rating not in the financial solidity expectable for the future, based on the trajectory the country is expected to have in the future, but on the past experience. Which means that, by definition, credit rating agencies will be more lenient towards rich countries than towards developing countries. It's part of the system to make sure that developing countries have higher interest rates than developed countries. I mean, it was very interesting to see it in Portugal. When we joined the European Union, all of a sudden, Portugal, that had very high interest rates, all of a sudden, I was in government when we had to reduce the budget deficit to get into the European Union. And you can't imagine that that was much more easy than what we thought, because simply the perspective that we would go to the European Union, to the euro, made interest rates come down substantially, which means the same country with the same economy, in the same situation, all of a sudden saw itself in a completely different situation in access to capital markets. And today, Portugal, that has a debt GDP ratio of about 100%, has access to credit in almost the same situation of Germany, with a little bit of a difference. And countries in the seats with a debt ratio much smaller have enormous difficulty to have access to capital markets, and have probably their bonds considered junk by the system. So we really need, at a certain moment, to address the question of power. And addressing the question of power at governance level, and addressing the question of power at reforms of what has been built until now to guarantee that the interests of the powerful would be preserved.
If I can put more context on the point with the credit rating agencies, that's our third point in Bridgetown 3.0, that we urge them to change their methodologies because it's not working for us at all. Barbados, when we first started being with a credit rating, was AA minus 20 years ago. We went down to junk, regrettably, in the last decade, and we've been coming back up. When we meet with them, they say that the likelihood of us ever being able to go back into the A's is impossible because of two things. One, a fixed exchange rate, and two, that we are too small and hence vulnerable. So that what you're effectively saying is that no small island state can enter the A club again. And this is where, therefore, I take the point that the Secretary General is making, and we say, look, unpack all of these things, deconstruct all of these things, because you surely can't have a club that is intended to oppress in perpetuity.
Absolutely. We have been, in the UN, through the voice of the Secretary General, has been very vocal about that. And in the Bridgetown Initiative, that is very clear. And also, in what you have been proposing, Prime Minister Browne, is very important, yes, because at the end, you know, the investment won't come. How are we going to get out of the vicious cycle if we cannot get the investment and the financing for the things that we have to do, for the opportunities that are there for the seats? Only 0.6% of total FDI in the world, at the global level, 0.6% comes to seats. You at least represent 1% of the population. So at least it has to be double. At least it has to be double. But it won't happen unless there are no guarantees. There will be a different way of looking at the guarantees, of taking the risk. As you have said, Secretary General, the multilateral development banks are there also to take the first risk, to crowd in private investment into these islands. And the Bridgetown Initiative also talks about this very strongly in terms of what has to happen. But you have talked about power and political will and the will to change. So If this is the biggest constraint to reform, what should we do? How can we push for the right actions to be taken? So,
thank you. I would like to elaborate on the issue of the power asymmetries that the Secretary General spoke about, the power asymmetries between large developed countries and developing countries, especially small island states. Within the international financial architecture, they have utilized their superior power to get favorable terms. And what we found is that they're even competing for FDI. So even though they have a significant amount of financial resources, you find that the global north is still competing with small developing states, island states, for capital. And what they've done from time to time, utilizing their superior power, is that they have introduced unjust sanctions against small states in particular. And I speak specifically to the issue of de-risking, the issue associated with our investment immigration programs, in which they have tried to vilify our programs that are designed to attract foreign direct investments. What we have done, we have actually incentivized investments with citizenship. Now, these countries in the global north, they have investment immigration programs too. And they have trillions of dollars flowing through their economies on a maybe daily basis. And you have small states with very small economies with total assets, in the case of Antigua and Barbuda, offshore banking assets of 1 billion, with maybe a handful of transactions, if that many, on a daily basis. And they argue vehemently that our financial system represents a risk to theirs. Evidently, the issue here is about the movement of capital. I am not convinced that our investment programs represent a risk to these countries. And almost invariably, every time we seek to diversify our economies to attract additional investments, recognizing that there's been limited financial flows to small island states, it's always a risk to the global north. So there has to be a more collaborative approach going forward, and for us to literally speak with each other rather than at each other, because some of the notions that they have, they're not real. I mean, I can't see, for example, how our banking system could have been a threat to these large countries with such a small asset base and few transactions. And what they have done is that they have de-risked many of our banks. We have had profitable banks within the Caribbean region, for example. I'm sure it's also the case in the Pacific and Indian Ocean Islands, in which they were profitable, but had to close doors because of de-risking, because of this notion that they represent a risk to the global north. Now, here we're fighting for additional financial resources, but if we do not have the infrastructure in place in which we can move monies, that we can receive payments and make payments, then evidently they are creating an artificial impediment to our development. So these are the type of abuses that we see within the system. And let me make the case here that we are not trying to go against the whole issue of tax transparency and accountability and so on, and we understand our obligation to concurrently address the issues of money laundering and terrorism financing, as well as tax transparency in conjunction with the global north. But at the same time, they are literally taking punitive and hostile actions against small, powerless state. And the irony about it, where the money laundering is actually taking place in the global north, they do nothing about it. And it's not that they do not know. In fact, they themselves have admitted that most of the money laundering is taking place in their jurisdictions. But on the other hand, they have failed to even place any of those powerful nations on any sanction list. But on the other hand, they continue to use these discriminatory tactics against these small, powerless states. So clearly, the issue of the power symmetries is a major problem, but we have to continue to advocate and to speak truth to power and to call them out. I think that is one of the ways to address these issues, as we get these various fora in which to speak, in the various international fora, the level of the UN, for example, and all the various fora, we must call them out and to confirm that, look, we are fighting here for justice. I mean, climate justice, financial justice, and justice to have a space at the table. We're all part of a common humanity. And just as how the global north, their citizens and residents, that they are deserving of having a good life, so should individuals in the developing countries, including small island states. So we have to continue to advocate. We also have to bring increased awareness at the level of the citizenry in all countries so that the citizenry could hold these, let's say, politicians and leaders accountable so that they can be a little more responsive in their policy choices and to understand that, I don't know if unintended or deliberately, but they're making policy choices that are literally undermining the development of a number of developing countries, including small island states. So we continue to advocate and look for champions like the Secretary General, who has been a major champion for developing countries globally. And if we can get a handful more of champions like the Secretary General, I'm quite sure that we'll be able to address the issue of the power asymmetries and the exploitation that is taking place within the global or the international space.
Thank you so much. Prime Minister Mottley.
I'll try to be short. The reality is that I came to public life because I wanted to fight injustice and to create platforms for people that would lead to enfranchisement. That is a misnomer in the global arena, regrettably. And I'm clear now that we have to find the opportunity to define win-win. What is a win for the North Atlantic countries and the other countries whose decision-making is critical to the reform of the system? And what is a win for not just SIDS, but developing countries? I believe that while we have been the ones on the front line, they are now beginning to realize that they too will be affected. And I keep saying, if they have a plan to move to Mars, they need to share it with the rest of us. Because unless they have that plan, they are going to be equally affected, and it is only a case of when, and in fact scale, because they are going to be more affected than even us in small island states in terms of loss of life and livelihood, etc. Secondly, that we need to also recognize that migration, that is the biggest issue that is upsetting politics in the United States of America, is upsetting politics, disrupting politics in Europe, that migration is as a result of a failure to come up with an appropriate development compact in many instances. And when this is compounded now by a climate crisis, that they have clearly forgotten what they were taught as children, that prevention is better than cure. Because what we're doing is effectively acting in a way that will allow the floodgates just to be opened up. And the reality is that these countries, and we see it in our own region. When I was growing up, Montserrat had a full population. Montserrat is now a country that is a shadow of itself because of volcanic eruption. And the injustice came that when the Montserratians, because they were small and nobody made, perhaps it wasn't the volume, but when they then had to go to the UK, on what terms did they access all benefits in the United Kingdom when they became refugees? That may have been the case with Montserrat. But if the climate crisis gets as aggressive as we expect it to get, they're not going to be able to ignore the reality that the flood of immigrants into these countries is going to put undue pressure on everything that they come to hold dearly in their own countries. Thirdly, I made the point that human beings, for the most part, are spiritual people. And organized religion, in a very real way, has taught us how to protect the vulnerable. It's part of our humanity. It is what we aspire to in terms of our spirituality. How do we do that and then not recognize that when we enter into the corridors of power, where we can walk the walk and not just talk it, that we fail to do so? And that's why I say, let us get into a room. When the world's richest countries wanted to do a global minimum tax it was done with warped speed. Warped speed. What stops us from coming together and begin to put a common compact in place that can save people? I make a simple statement that the others laugh when I say it. When you're dead, you're dead. When you're dead, you can't bring back people. And therefore, the ability to act insensitively, recklessly as to the loss of lives is what amazes me, because none of us has the ability to bring back a life. And if we continue to let people get away and behave as if they're normal and human in every other respect, but then don't act in that way, we have to call it out. And Secretary General, I want to offer you our full and complete support. Whether it is in calling for new social partnerships, new contracts, common agenda, now the Summit for the Future to force us to think these things through, there has to be a moral compass guiding leadership across the world. And regrettably, your voice has been a lone wolf in some arena, but when you think it is a lone wolf, know that there are a lot of small ones behind you really lifting you up, because you are speaking truth to power, and you are in fact reflecting the needs of 1/5 of your membership, and probably more, because let's go beyond SIDS now, the developing world. And if we don't have that consistent voice, then we get the hypocrisy that undermines people's trust in the world, and that is when we start to get lone wolves and terrorism and insecurity. So I pray that hope will triumph over all of that, and that we can have that win-win conversation in the same room.
Secretary General, you have the last word.
I think that Jean Monnet said that he was not optimistic nor pessimistic, he was determined. We need to be determined. This is not going to be easy, but we need to be determined. And independently, and I fully share the question of the moral values, and I fully share that, but independently of it, I think we need to go on insisting until those that have power understand that it is in their enlightened self-interest to promote a reform when they are still in a position to control the direction of the reform. Because there is one thing that is clear. Power relations are changing in the world as we speak. And the risk for me is that if there is not a reform of the present financial system that is too small, controlled by the G7, but too small, there will be inevitably a fragmentation. And the IMF will no longer be the lender of last resort. There will be others. There is already a bit of it. And the World Bank will be smaller than, today is already smaller than the European Investment Bank, just to give an example, but other things will come. And so, first, it is important to understand that power relations are changing. The risk for me, the biggest risk is, as I see the big emerging economies having a bigger and bigger role, is that if in the end this translates itself, you talk about the G20, in a pact among the big, forgetting the small. Because inevitably the big emerging economies will have a stronger and stronger voice in the way institutions work, and even probably in the reform of institutions. But this should not be a question among the big. This needs to be a universal question of justice for everybody. But the present system is not sustainable. So it's an enlightened self-interest of those that control the present system to assume the leadership of its reform.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. This has been a wonderful panel. You have to agree with me. This has to be repeated many times. I go with you I am hopeful. I think that the Summit of the Future can be a great opportunity for the world if we unite the voice of the developing countries, if we unite the voice of the seats, we can make a change. And fragmentation is a real risk. And we have to remember that inclusion doesn't mean to substitute the center. It means to expand it. We need a center that will include all of us, and we need an expansion of voice and power in the world. So thank you all very much. We have to end here. You want to say something here? Mia,
No,
sorry, I see you.
just that I do think that we started to go in the right direction with the Paris Pact for People and Planet. But for whatever reasons, you can't get unanimity among the G7. And if we can get that unanimity among the G7, instead of having the disorderly disruption, as the SG said, we can have an orderly transformation. And that's the only point.
Let's try for the world not to fragment into the rich, the big, and the rest. Thank you very much.